My parents stole my inheritance and laughed in my face, but they never expected what came next. My childhood wasn't bad exactly. I wasn't locked in a basement or forced to beg for scraps on the street. But it wasn't warm either. I was more like an accessory to my parents' lives than an actual priority. A side character in the grand, messy play they called life. If there was one source of unconditional love I had growing up, it was my grandparents. They were the ones who picked me up from school when my parents forgot. They were the ones who made sure I had new clothes when my parents blew through their paychecks on weekend getaways or impulsive car upgrades. They were the ones who actually seemed to see me, and they worried about me. My parents were always bad with money. Always. My dad made decent money, but he spent it like he was allergic to keeping his savings account above 2 digits. My mom loved the high life, designer bags, salon trips, expensive dinners, all while ignoring the fact that bills were piling up. My grandparents saw it too, and they weren't quiet about it. I still remember sitting at their kitchen table, listening to them argue with my parents about finances. "You need to start saving," Grandpa would say, shaking his head. "You can't just expect money to fall from the sky." "Oh, come on, Dad," my mom would scoff. "We're fine. We're making memories, not hoarding cash like some stingy old misers." "Making memories doesn't pay off debt," Grandma would add, her voice sharp in that way that meant she was barely keeping her patience. Those fights never changed anything. If anything, they made my parents double down. Maybe that's why my grandparents took precautions. From the time I was little, they told me, "This money is for you." Not for my parents. For me. They put aside savings, talked to lawyers, and made it clear that when they passed, their estate would go toward securing my future. I believed them. A few months before my grandfather died, I finally saved up enough money to move out of my parents' house. It wasn't much, a tiny apartment in a bad neighborhood. The rent ate up most of my paycheck, my student loans were hanging over my head, and I had enough food to last me a week. I was thriving, but just barely. That's why the inheritance was going to change everything. When they passed away within a year of each other, first Grandpa from a heart attack, and then Grandma for what I swear was a broken heart, I held on to that. It was the only thing that brought me any kind of comfort. They were gone, but at least they had made sure I would be okay. At least, that's what I thought. The funeral came and went. My parents were appropriately teary-eyed, though it was hard to tell how much of it was grief and how much was performative. They made a big show of being the grieving children, shaking hands, collecting sympathy, basking in the attention. And then nothing. Days passed, then weeks. I waited. I thought maybe I had to be patient, that the legal process took time. But something in the back of my mind kept nagging at me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. My parents didn't seem sad. If anything, they seemed lighter, happier. When I finally got tired of waiting, I asked them about it. "Hey, did Grandpa and Grandma leave anything for me?" I remember them saying they had something set aside. My mom waved a hand dismissively, barely looking up from her phone. "Oh, don't worry about it, sweetheart. We're handling everything." My dad, flipping through a travel magazine, just snorted. There wasn't much left anyway, just enough to cover some loose ends. Something about the way he said it, casual, almost mocking, made my stomach twist. But I didn't push. Not then, because I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe my own parents wouldn't steal from me. I should have known better. I let it go. For a while. I was grieving, and fighting about money felt wrong, like it cheapened their deaths. But then, about 6 months later, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I was scrolling through social media when a post appeared on my feed. It was my mom, smiling in front of a beach resort with a drink in her hand, and next to her was my dad, looking equally smug, finally taking that dream vacation. The caption read, followed by a string of tropical emojis. The pictures kept coming. Luxury hotel suites, 5-star dining, shopping sprees, spa treatments, first-class flights. They were living it up, big time, and suddenly everything clicked. The inheritance, the sudden brushing off of my questions, the way they had seemed lighter, happier after my grandparents passed. They had taken it. They had taken every last cent. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through post after post, each one hammering in the truth I had been too afraid to face. My parents, my own flesh and blood, had stolen from me. They didn't even try to hide it. It took me a full minute to process what I was looking at. My parents laughing on some private beach, sipping cocktails that probably cost more than my grocery budget for a month. My dad lounging in a poolside cabana with sunglasses that looked suspiciously designer. My mom posing in front of a boutique line with handbags that I knew damn well weren't cheap. I scrolled down, my mind racing. Post after post, picture after picture. Fancy restaurants, spa treatments, expensive excursions. And not just one vacation, there were timestamps. They had been traveling for months. Italy, Greece, Dubai. It wasn't a single splurge. This was an entirely new lifestyle. And it hit me all at once. They weren't just spending some of the money. They had burned through all of it. The inheritance, the money my grandparents had explicitly set aside for me, the money they swore was protected, the money that was supposed to be my foundation for a better future. Gone. Wasted on overpriced resort stays and first-class flights, on meals they probably couldn't even pronounce, on impulse buys they wouldn't even remember in a year. I sat frozen in my tiny apartment, the reality sinking in like a punch to the gut. I had spent the past few months living paycheck to paycheck, eating the cheapest food I could find, rationing gas money, worrying every single day about how I was going to afford rent. Meanwhile, my parents were island hopping, wearing brand new clothes, booking massages, throwing money around like it was limitless. And it was my money. When I called them and demanded an explanation about the money, my mom said, "You don't need them anyway." My father laughed. "What were you going to do with that money? Throw it away." They laughed at me when I said I would hire a lawyer. That's when the panic set in. My breath came short, my hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just unfair. This was theft. Actual, legal theft. This wasn't just parents being irresponsible with money. This was fraud. I grabbed my laptop, my fingers shaking as I typed in search after search. Public records, probate filings, anything I could find. It didn't take long to piece together what had happened. My grandparents had left $250,000, $250,000, more than enough for me to pay off my student loans, put a down payment on a house, finally stop living paycheck to paycheck. A real chance to start my life. But my parents had intercepted it. The documents were right there, buried under layers of legal jargon. They had filed as the estate's executors, claimed the money as theirs, and drained it before I even knew it existed. They had done it fast, too. Within weeks of my grandmother's funeral, every last cent had been transferred out, and they had gotten away with it. For months, I had been struggling. For months, I had been barely scraping by, thinking the money was still tied up in some complicated legal process. And all that time, my parents had been spending my future like it was their personal jackpot. My stomach turned. I felt sick, betrayed in a way I couldn't even put into words. It wasn't just the money. It was the principle. My grandparents had trusted them. They had left that money for me. And instead of respecting that, my parents had stolen it. Lied about it. Laughed in my face while they booked their next vacation. I tried to calm down, to think rationally, but the more I thought about it, the worse it got. I remembered every financial worry I had stressed over in the past few months. The nights I had skipped meals to make sure I could pay rent. The moments I had debated whether I could afford to keep the heat on in winter. Every sacrifice, every struggle, while they had been drinking champagne on a yacht. I couldn't let this go. I wouldn't. The first thing I did was call the lawyer who had handled my grandparents' estate. I had met him once, years ago, when my grandfather first mentioned setting up the inheritance. I didn't expect much. Lawyers didn't exactly work for free, but I needed to know my options. It didn't take long for him to confirm what I already knew. My parents had committed fraud. They had forged documents claiming that as my legal guardians, they had control over the estate, even though I was a legal adult. They had exploited loopholes, rushed the process, and funneled the money straight into their accounts. I asked what I could do. The lawyer hesitated. Cases like this were messy. Family disputes over money almost always were. But when I asked if I had grounds for a lawsuit, he didn't even pause. Yes, I had every right to take them to court, and I was going to. The rage that had been simmering inside me boiled over into something cold, sharp, and deadly precise. My parents had spent months thinking they had gotten away with it. They had mocked me, dismissed me, left me to struggle while they enjoyed my money. They thought I was weak. They were about to find out how wrong they were. I didn't tell them what I was doing. I didn't warn them. I wanted them to enjoy their last few weeks of comfort, their last moments of believing they had outsmarted me. Instead, I spent the next few weeks gathering everything. Bank statements, transaction records, screenshots of their vacation photos, each time-stamped perfectly, copies of legal filings that prove the money had been meant for me. I left no stone unturned. Then, when I was ready, I had my lawyer serve them with a lawsuit. I wasn't just suing them to get my money back. I was going to ruin them. I didn't sleep the night before filing the lawsuit. Not because I was scared. I had long since burned through fear. No, this was something different. I kept picturing their faces when they opened the envelope. The moment they realized they had been caught. The second they understood that I wasn't just angry, I was coming for them. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about principle. It was about the months I had spent struggling while they were sipping cocktails on the beaches of Italy. The nights I had gone to bed with a pit in my stomach, wondering how I would make rent while they were buying designer clothes. The way they had looked me in the eye and laughed when I asked about my own inheritance. I wanted them to feel everything I had felt. So when the papers were finally served, I waited. And the meltdown came immediately. It started with the phone calls. My mom, crying hysterically, leaving long, rambling voicemails about how I was overreacting, about how I should have come to them first, how we could have worked this out as a family. Worked it out? They had stolen $250,000 from me. My money my grandparents had saved for me. Not for their gambling addiction, not for their vacations, not for their overpriced luxury lifestyle. I didn't answer. Then came my dad. He didn't even pretend to be remorseful. His first voicemail was all threats. He raged about how I was ungrateful, about how I was betraying my own family. He went on and on about how no real son would take their parents to court. Then, the guilt tripping started. They went crying to every single relative, twisting the story to make it seem like I was some money-hungry brat suing them for no reason. The calls from relatives started flooding in. They're your parents. They made mistakes, but they still raised you. Do you really want to see them homeless? And the worst one, would your grandparents have wanted this? That one nearly made me snap. Because I knew exactly what my grandparents would have wanted. They would have wanted me to fight. They would have wanted me to stand up for myself, to demand justice. My grandfather had been a man of principle. He would have hated what my parents did. So I tuned out every single guilt-tripping voice and kept pushing forward. I met with my lawyer and laid everything out. I had receipts, bank statements showing the missing inheritance money, legal documents proving I was the rightful heir, a paper trail of their fraudulent filings, screenshots of their vacation posts, each one time-stamped, each one flaunting my stolen money. My lawyer was ecstatic. He said this was one of the most blatant cases of fraud he had ever seen. They had made zero effort to hide their tracks. They had bragged about their crimes on social media. They had even paid off their house directly from the inheritance account, making it nearly impossible to deny what they had done. We weren't just filing a civil lawsuit. We were going after them for fraud, embezzlement, and theft. And once the charges were filed, shit hit the fan. When my parents received the official court summons, everything changed. They went from angry and defensive to terrified. Their threats disappeared. Now, my dad was begging me to reconsider. My mom was sobbing in messages, saying they had made a mistake and asking me to just talk. Then came the bribes. First, they offered me a small chunk of the money, $20,000, if I dropped the case. That was less than 10% of what they had stolen. They were desperate. When that didn't work, they offered me the car they had bought with my inheritance. I refused. Then the house. They said they would put the house in my name if I agreed to drop everything. But I didn't want their house. I wanted justice, and I wanted them to suffer. So I refused every deal, ignored every message, and let the case go to trial. When the trial started, my parents tried to play the victims. My mom came in crying, acting like she was some poor, innocent woman who had just made a little financial mistake. My dad tried to act like it was all a misunderstanding, like they had only spent the money because they thought it was okay. But my lawyer tore them apart. The judge looked disgusted when she saw the vacation photos, the shopping sprees, the casino transactions. My parents had stolen a life-changing amount of money and had wasted most of it. The evidence was so overwhelming that their defense fell apart in minutes. The ruling was brutal. They were forced to sell their house to pay me back. They were ordered to pay damages and legal fees. Every luxury they had bought with my money had to be liquidated. They lost everything. The judge didn't just hit them with a civil case. She recommended a full investigation into the fraud allegations, which meant that my parents also faced criminal consequences. I walked out of the courtroom free, but they walked out devastated. Winning the lawsuit should have felt like the ultimate victory, and in some ways it was. But after the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, I realized something. My parents weren't just defeated, they were finished. I thought I had prepared myself for it, for the way their world would crumble. But nothing could have fully braced me for the complete freefall they were about to experience. The court's decision was clear. They owed me every single cent of the inheritance they stole, plus damages and my legal fees. That meant they had to liquidate everything. The house, the cars, the furniture, even the damn jewelry my mom had flaunted online. It wasn't a question of if they would lose it all. It was when, and the when happened fast. The house was the first thing to go. The court had given them a deadline to sell and pay me back, and if they didn't, the state would seize the property. They had no choice. It was humiliating for them. My mom had spent years treating the house like a status symbol, acting like it placed her above people. She had spent my money redecorating it, turning it into some magazine-ready, soulless shrine to her own ego. And now, she had to stand there while potential buyers toured it like an open exhibit, judging every detail of what was once hers. I didn't even need to be there to witness it. I heard everything through the grapevine of nosy family members who suddenly had a lot less to say in my parents' defense. The house sold fast. It was a hot market, and a newly remodeled home in a good area, gone in weeks. That was the final nail in the coffin for their social standing. People talk. Their friends from a neighborhood, people they had spent years bragging to, showing off to, immediately distanced themselves. No one wanted to be associated with convicted frauds who had stolen from their own kid. They were officially outcasts, and with no home, no friends, and a mountain of debt, they spiraled. After they lost the house, they moved into a tiny apartment on the opposite side of town. Nothing like the life they were used to, and they couldn't handle it. My dad, who had spent years looking down on people who struggled financially, was now one of them. My mom, who had wasted my money on luxury spa days and designer bags, was now shopping at thrift stores. It didn't take long before the begging started. A message from my mom, "Hey, can we talk?" sent in the middle of the night. A missed call from my dad. Then, more desperate attempts. They needed money. Not just for rent, but for everything. They had burned through every dollar they had ever touched. They had never learned to live within their means, and now, without stolen funds to prop them up, they were drowning. For months, I had been the one struggling. I had spent nights choosing between food or bills, had scraped by while they had been burning my future on vacations and casinos. Now, they were the ones suffering, and they wanted me to save them. I ignored them for months, refused to engage. But then, one night, it got one last call from my mother. I don't know why I picked up. Maybe curiosity. Maybe some small part of me wanted to hear her acknowledge everything. She sounded broken, destroyed. She was crying so hard she could barely get the words out. She said they had nowhere to go, that they were behind on rent, that my dad's gambling had spiraled, that they had burned every bridge. She asked if I could help her. I sat there, listening completely numb, and then I thought back to everything. To the day I first asked about my inheritance, and they laughed in my face. To the months I'd spent barely surviving while they were out blowing through my money. To every single moment they had mocked me, dismissed me, stolen from me, betrayed me. And then I said it. The same words my mom had told me all those months ago. "You didn't need it anyway." And I hung up. That was the last time I ever heard from them. I moved on, took the money I had fought so hard for, and rebuilt my life. I paid off my debts, bought a home, not a mansion, not a trophy house, but a place that was mine. Started saving, investing, creating the stable future my grandparents had wanted for me all along. And my parents? They were exactly where they had put me. Struggling, desperate, alone. For once, they were the ones who had nothing. I had everything I needed.